got our 87 C10 back in the shop today. We used it to develop the street grip system, and now we're going to use it to develop the coilover system. So we're putting on one of the very first kits here today. We do have access to a lift for this truck, but since we have to start by taking the bed off, it's going to be just as easy to remove the bed on the floor and do the rear suspension on the ground.
You want me to go ahead and start undoing the taillight wiring harness and all that good stuff?
Yes. Yeah, I'll get the bed bolts started here. On these trucks, there's 8 bed bolts, and they're carriage bolts, so that you really don't have to hold the top unless your bed is in rough shape.
Could you apply some pressure to this rear carriage bolt there?
Those are terrible. I doubt it's been apart since '87 though, so. I'm checking to see if there's any extra ground straps that ground the bed to the chassis. And we do need to actually take them off. When you're removing one of these beds, you always want to make sure everything's disconnected. A couple of guys, probably 4 is going to take for a short bed. That'll get that bed right off. Now that we've got the bed off, first thing to do on the instructions is to remove the existing brake line bracket. Now, because this has been our R&D truck for other projects, this truck already has a street grip system on it. So some of the brackets are going to be a little bit different, but we're going to point that out as we go. So this bracket needs to come off. We're going to remove these 2 rivets on this brake line bracket. And I like to split this head of this rivet with a die grinder first. That makes peeling it off with the air chisel a lot easier. I'm going to cut this bracket because there's a really good chance that we're not going to have to separate this brake line from the rubber hose during this install. I'm going to start working on the C-notch on the passenger side. John's going to remove what's left of the street grip system on the driver's side.
Edit that first. I can go ahead and loosen this, right? You won't need it to locate anything, correct?
You are correct. Even though this truck has the street grip system on it already, the brackets that you're going to be removing are in the same location. They're just going to look a little bit different. This rear leaf spring hanger, while we are going to remove it on our truck, it does not interfere with anything on the 4-link, so if you were in a time crunch, you would not have to remove it for any reason. When you're putting these C-notches in, there's a factory hole in the frame to reference off of, and I've got that marked on this frame with an arrow, and I just lined up the rest of them using the template, marked them, and then I always hold up the C-notch before I do any cutting to verify.
Narrow that up too much.
I like to start with a pilot hole for the 1/2-inch holes in the corners of the C-notch. That way you don't have to strain yourself or your drill. Now that those holes are drilled, I can mark where I need to cut. Just to make sure, I'm going to hold this C-notch up here one more time before I do any cutting. I'm removing this brake line mounting tab here because we're going to need to cut through this area to mount the C-notch. Before we cut these C-notches in, I'm going to support this rear frame just as a precaution. It's not going to sag, but it's a good idea. There are a lot of different ways to cut out these C-notches, but in our case, the cuts are pretty straight, so I used a cut-off wheel, but a plasma cutter or die grinder would work also. Now that I got this notch cut out, I test fit it. Once I knew it was good, I put a little paint on these edges to keep it from rusting behind the notch. These C-notches fit tight, so it does take a little persuasion to get them into place.
There's all hardware for that, and I'll start bolting that on.
It should be in that box that's open on the floor. Index hole to 7/16. John and I are going to trade places now. He's going to put all the bolts in and drill the holes for the C-notch on the passenger side, and I'm going to go over to the driver's side and start doing some cutting. It's always a good idea to put the bolts in on the side of the C-notch to make sure that it is fully tight against the frame before you start drilling your holes in the top. There are a lot of holes to drill on these, but all the bolts we use is why it's so strong.
Top and bottom ones.
After the C-notches have been installed, the upper cross member can be installed. Cross member is located using the 3 holes at the top of the C-notch. Depending on your exhaust and everything else you got going on back there, this spare tire mount may have to be repositioned temporarily to get that cross member in. There we go. As you're putting this cross member in here, there's several different layers of material and a couple different bolts and a lot of things going on. It'd be really easy to get this brake line pinched behind something, so make sure that that's out of the way when you start tightening your bolts up for the cross member. While we were worried about pinching the line back here, we ended up with this rubber line on top of this cross member, and it needs to be on the bottom side, so we're going to take the brake line apart and fix that. The next step is to knock off these front spring eye hangers, and to do that we got to take these rivets out, so we'll do the same thing again and split the heads with a die grinder before we use the air chisel to knock them off. If your truck's got dual tanks like this one does, when you're using your die grinder or other device to get these rivet heads off, you're going to be pretty close to the gas tank, so use precaution.
Okay.
These front brackets utilize holes that are already in the frame, so there isn't any doubt on where it goes. There are quite a few bolts again on this piece, but that's what gives it its strength. Now once that's done, we're going to get to these lower brackets. Make sure you stick to the instructions close on this part. The lower bracket is an integral part, so that's why we supply a torque spec. These 4-link bars are already preset. Even though they're adjustable, we set them at the shop before you ever get your parts. The good thing about a 4-link is that it's going to keep a pretty constant pinion angle throughout the suspension travel, unlike a leaf spring when it can wrap under hard acceleration. Our 4-link is pretty beefy, so you're not going to have any problems if you still want to use your truck as a truck. Now that we got all 4 of our 4-link bars attached, we're going to go ahead and put the panhard bar on and then attach the rear coilovers. The panhard bar that we provide is also preset, but once you get your truck down on the ground at ride height, you probably want to double check the distance between your wheel and tire and the outside of your bed just to make sure. These coilovers don't really care which way they're mounted, but on this particular truck, we find it a lot easier to adjust the shocks with the knobs facing up. So I like to turn the shock knob all the way in and then back it out till it's in the middle, and that is a really good place to start with the adjustment. To clear these C-notches, there is a little cutting to be done on one of the bed supports. The instructions are pretty clear and it tells you exactly how many inches over to measure, so we're going to go ahead and cut that out. Just like we did when we cut the C-notches in, I'm going to clean up these edges and spray a little paint on there so rust doesn't start immediately. Now that we're done with that, we're going to put the bed back on and start putting the bed bolts in. I'm going to use a little anti-seize on these bolts just in case I ever needed to take the bed off again. It really takes 2 people to get these bed bolt holes lined up. Now that we got that rear finished, we're going to move the truck over to the lift to do the front suspension. It's going to make it a lot easier for us to do. To make this go a little bit quicker, I'm going to work on the driver's side, John's going to work on the passenger side. I started by removing this tie rod end so that I could pivot this spindle independent of what he's trying to work on there to make it a lot easier for me to get the caliper off, go forward. So we can take the caliper off and hang it up so it's not, brake line's not under tension while we're working. Just like the street grip system, the spindle that we provide in the kit here will allow you to use your stock brakes, provided they are the heavy-duty version. I'm going to move on to removing these shocks. They are already RideTech shocks from our street grip system. They're going to come off the exact same way as your stock shocks will. The new coilover system we're installing won't be using this shock stud on the frame, so you can remove it if you like. Always use a spring compressor. Our truck has the street grip kit on it, so we have short springs on here and they're gonna drop right out, but your stock springs are gonna be a lot longer and under a lot more tension, so always use a spring compressor. I'm gonna take these alignment shims out and save them. Normally, you would just take the spindle off with the upper arm or with the lower arm. On this truck, we had already done R&D work and had a street grip spindle on there, and that drop spindle is the same drop spindle we use on the coilover kit, so we're going to reuse that spindle. These lower control arms are mounted with U-bolts, so really the only thing you need to do is take off the 4 nuts and it drops right out. Got her? Now that we've got the control arms off, there is a brace between the cross member and the frame that needs to be removed, and I've marked the rivets that need to be taken off. These braces not only use rivets, they also have bolts on the frame rail that hold them on. Once you've got this piece removed, be sure to knock the remainder of your rivets through the frame cross member, because that is how your template is going to line up for cutting the hole for the coilover. We provide templates for both sides, driver and passenger. So after you've got your rivets knocked through, all you need to do is line up the holes, mark the center for cutting out for your coilover. Just like the C-notches, there are many ways to cut these holes. We did have a plasma cutter available, so that's what we used. The top of this cross member needs to be completely flat for our new bracket to mount correctly. There may be a little trimming that needs to be done after your initial cut. Our bracket has a capturing area for the head of the bolt, that when you push it down in there, you don't have to hold it from the back side of the frame rail, so it's a nice addition. Our kit does include all the hardware necessary. We don't skimp on that at all. And the bags of hardware are labeled, so you don't just have a pile of bolts to start with. Okay. On these lower control arm cross shafts, there are 2 sets of holes that line up with these pins. Make sure to go by the instructions and take a measurement on yours so that the lower control arms get installed correctly. Once you have those pins lined up on the lower cross shaft, you can install the nuts on your U-bolts and tighten everything up. We're going to take off the street grip sway bar. Your stock bar will be very similar and come off the same way. Our upper arms use our caster slug cross shaft. There's a couple of different ways to put these on, so go by the instructions to make a decision on what's right for you. These are really precise and they fit tight, so make sure the caster slugs are seated in the cross shaft before you tighten up your nuts. I went ahead and put these alignment shims back in that I had taken out on the stock arms. This will get us close enough until we get it properly aligned. Now we're going to put in our coilover, starting with the upper mount. See? Yeah. We're going to put the spindle back on. Always make sure to use the correct cotter keys I always like to use new cotter pins no matter how good a shape the old ones are. This kit does allow the use of your stock brakes, so that's what we're going to be putting back on. But our spindle will allow most aftermarket brake systems to be installed also. It's always a good idea to grease these ball joints even though they're new. The front sway bar uses these Delrin liners for the bushings. It drastically reduces stiction and any kind of noises that you would normally hear with polyurethane bushings. We're using our posi links for end links on this sway bar. It, along with the bushings that are Delrin and the sway bar bushings that we use the Delrin liners on, this kit really reduces the stiction and binding that a conventional suspension system would have. Now that we've got this system installed, we're going to take some measurements to check ride height. Because this is a coilover system, you can adjust your preload on your springs to change the ride height somewhat. So you'll want to custom tailor that to whatever suits you, depending on your wheel and tire package.